Hey everybody, welcome back to Elf Bait. It's early this morning, so it may sound a little rough, and with the allergy season coming along, a little nasally, so I apologize. But I figured it was time to get back in and get videos going. It's been a while since I've done videos. I apologize for the long gap. We had a lot going on. Anybody who is particularly astute will notice that the shelf and the fridge have switched sides. That was part of what was going on. The garage has changed status, and it is actually now half mine full time. So I now have my own crafting area and gaming area and stuff out here. But that took some time. We had a kid move back in. Just a lot of real life stuff. So what I wanted to get on this morning and talk about was sort of this conversation I've been hearing a lot online, or reading a lot online, because basically you really don't hear much. But the dialogue over characters with different mobilities, and we're not talking about in the disabilities sort of a sense. We're talking about player races or character races that have movement styles, movements besides walking. Notably, the argument centers around, has been around Aarakocra in the past, and then now we have centaurs. So, and it's interesting because both of these arguments sort of sit on different sides of that argument fence. So, for the Aarakocra, it is flight. And for the centaur, it is the fact that they're quadrupeds, and how that works in a campaign. Now, part of the centaur dialogue is also over the fact that it is another race, like the Goliath, that should be a large creature, but is treated as a medium creature for sake of consistency with game rules. And that's really all that needs to be said. It is that way because they wrote it that way, and because as a PC, your rules are slightly different than the NPCs and the monsters. They, to make them consistent with Adventurers League and to weed out a lot of the unnecessary fiddly bits that come with stat bonuses and stuff for a higher size category, they have gone ahead and reduced. They made that decision to change them to change their size category. So, but talking about mobility. So with the Aarakocra, the main issue that I hear argued about is their ability to fly. So first of all, their ability to fly is at the detriment to their ground speed. And so ground speed is certainly a factor in the game, because a lot of times you're needing that ground speed to close a gap with an enemy or cross an area of effect within a single move, so you're not going to be affected by it twice. Movement does play an important part in the game, and so that of course some folks are going to say, well, if it doesn't matter that they can only walk 25, their ground speed's only 25 feet, because they can fly 50. So they can fly 50. Well, flight, and the big contention seems to be around flight and how game-breaking flight is, and how much it ruins the game. And nobody complains about some of the other abilities that are pretty tough and mighty that have a strong effect on gameplay. Half orcs and their abilities that allow them to just be super tough. Halflings have their luck ability, which is pretty interesting and pretty cool. But the flight, everybody's convinced, and when I say everybody, that's the figurative everybody. That's the everybody who's complaining. Flight, everybody's convinced that this is going to somehow derail their campaign, that a DM is not going to be, it's going to take the game out of the hands of the DM, and it's going to undo his best laid plans. That's only the case if he has very limited plans, or if he doesn't adapt or flow with it. And that's even going to the point where flight becomes a problem, because flight really isn't a problem. Flight mitigates itself. So first of all, going back to the rules as written for the Aarakocra cannot fly while wearing heavy or medium armor. That means the Aarakocra is very vulnerable, and I guarantee you he's not going to be walking around with a change of armor. You know, here guys, hold my breastplate, hold my chainmail greaves, I'm going to take to the air. You know, he's not running off into a convenient phone booth in the dungeon, and we'll get to that in a moment. He's not going to run off to a convenient phone booth and take to the air wearing his Aarakocra supersuit so he can avoid the heavy armor, medium armor restriction. This stuff is necessary, otherwise I can't talk. So that is the mechanics. They can only walk 25 feet. They can't wear medium and heavy armor while flying, but they can still fly, right? So I mean, everything the game is ruined. Not really. Not most, but a good portion of your dungeons are your adventures, and I'll use the term dungeon in the classic sense, where any adventure you're on is kind of a dungeon. If you're in the woods and you're an Aarakocra, you're probably not flying too well, because you're not a little bird going from tree to tree. You're a 6-foot bird with big wings. If you're in a cave or tunnel, there's no way you're flying. If you're inside a castle, you're not flying. If you're in tight terrain like a mountain pass or anything, you might be able to fly up, but you're not going to be flittering about the crevices. Now, you could certainly fly up and get a better vantage point and stuff like that. So movement is not going to be too superior with flight. There are going to be some instances where you certainly do better than the rest of the party, and you can aid the rest of the party. But that's what playing a character race is about. It's about having a special ability that aids the party. The Aarakocra isn't getting free magic like elf characters do. The Aarakocra isn't getting automatic friendship with animals like the gnomes are. Aarakocra is not getting special stone senses or luck abilities or anything like that, like halflings and dwarves. And we'll turn this off right here. Oops. So again, it's movement. It's just movement. Now, a good player is going to know how to use that movement to his advantage, but mechanically speaking, movement, whether it's flight or movement, whether it's walking, is still movement. So, combat. Let's look at combat. So, unless you're playing an Aarakocra that is really good at flight, or really good at missile combat, flight is not going to be a serious advantage for you in combat. Now, an Aarakocra, especially the new ones, with the hands that are separate from their wings instead of the classic Aarakocra where the wings were on the hands were on the wings, could, in theory, sit back and use a bow from the air. Fire down. He could throw spears. He could throw javelins. He might do dive bomb attacks. The old Aarakocra had this really cool thing where they would put javelins in their feet and dive bomb their enemies. So you could do that. If you're spellcaster, you could fly above and you could zap down on the enemy and stuff. That's cool. It's actually kind of cool if you're again, this is great if you're in open terrain. But if you're in the forest, the minute you go up above the level of the path, you're in the canopy of the trees. I know where I live in the Northwest here, we have all these wonderful pine needle or dirt covered paths between the trees, but those evergreens are thick when you go up more than 10 feet. And even in a deciduous forest, even in the dead of winter, while there's no leaves there's still branches. So flying upwards through a forest is going to be difficult terrain if you wanted to put a ruling on it. And this is and that kind of is at the core of it. When you're talking about these differently mobile characters, a lot of the arguments forget about the fact that there's a DM at the table, and the DM is going to be able to rule on these things. It's not, yes, it says 50 feet, but just like any other situation, sure, anytime a character moves, it's subject to the ruling of the DM. That ground is too unstable. You have to, if you're going to run across it, it's going to be difficult terrain, or you're going to have to make a dex save to try and not trip in the pitted ground, something to that effect. So your Aarakocra flying in combat is going to be good in open areas. If your Aarakocra is not a missile fighter, he's a melee fighter, he's still going to have to engage in melee range to attack. Although I'm going to imagine that if anybody is making an Aarakocra character, they're probably using melee as their secondary, but still, melee is still melee. You still have to be in range. The other thing, too, is if you're the only flying character in the party and you go up into the air, you become an instant target for anybody with ranged weapons. An example I've used a lot is your typical collection of goblins. A typical collection of encounter of goblins can be a mix of melee fighters and short bows. And so while those goblins in the front are going to be fighting the enemies that they can, and in the past they might, skirt off to the side and try and sneak in a shot now and again with their short bows, that Aarakocra takes to the air, those goblins are now going to focus fire on him. The other thing, and then this brings into another consideration. There might be spellcasters in that encounter. There could be some sort of monster with a magical effect. An Aarakocra that is flying and then is suddenly made unable to fly, whether that's through, taking enough damage to where he goes to 0, which, face it, low-level characters are going to do. So if he becomes the target of all those short bows and every short bow is going at him, Law of Averages says he's going to be taking, quite a few d6 of damage. So if he goes to 0 hit points, or somebody casts a web spell in the area or on him, or somebody does some sort of paralysis magic or has a gaze attack, hold person, I think an Aarakocra still category, if it's a PC race, I think it still falls under the description of person. There are sleep spells, all sorts of ways that to make that Aarakocra unable to flap those wings of his, and then he's going to fall. He's going to take falling damage. Now, if he's already gone unconscious and he's taking falling damage, you could make a good argument for the normal taking damage while at 0, while incapacitated. He's falling, he's incapacitated, so great, now he's failing death saves. So there's that. The other thing to consider is, much like I was talking about with the terrain, there are other dungeon effects and stuff that could come into it that I, as a DM, and it's not to be a jerk to the Aarakocra, it's just accepting of what's going on for that Aarakocra. So the rest of the party is trying to move through, let's say you're moving through the tunnels, and you get to that very classic web-strewn cavern. You get to the cavern, there's webbing, sticky webs crisscrossing it, and the party decides to go through it. Okay, well, that's great. Most of the party has just themselves and their equipment. The Aarakocra has these giant wings off its back. As a DM, I would say that Aarakocra is going to have to make any, like dex checks or whatever, to avoid those webs at a disadvantage. So granted, that seems fair. It's not unusual. It's not excessive. You're asking him to take into account the fact that he has big wings sticking off his back. I would do this for any larger creature. Like if a Goliath was going through there, and even though they play as medium characters, they're 7-8 feet tall. All right, well, the space is tight. You're going to be at a disadvantage. Similar to the Centaur. Centaur is a big mass of monster. You've got most of a horse attached to most of a human being. That's a big creature. Even though the rules say it counts as mechanically as medium, that's why we have a DM. The DM is there to adjudicate those things that are not specifically covered in the rules, or maybe a bit of a nuance on the rules. And so, differently mobile characters and flyers, hoverers, if they they made a slitherer or a swimmer, all these characters have these special abilities, special movement abilities. They're not some sort of new powerhouse. It's just movement. And while it does afford them some tactical advantage, it is countered by a lot of disadvantage, often in role-play situations, not tactically speaking, but if you're trying to sneak somewhere and you have giant wings sticking off your back, it's not as easy to disguise yourself as every other race that's basically human shaped. They're just different sizes. A centaur is going to be near impossible to disguise. You can't disguise him as somebody riding a horse because the human is far too forward. Human part's far too forward. So you can't just like throw a tarp over him. Well, you could if he was laying on the back of a cart or something. Centaurs are going to be hampered by ladders. True enough. It doesn't mean you stop putting ladders in dungeons. It just means that the party's going to have to get creative if they come to a ladder. Although I can say that the number of times a ladder has factored into an adventure, and this is another thing, these arguments that are coming up against or in complaint about these races with the different movement methods and the different body sizes and stuff like that come down to very circumstantial arguments that I can't say are all that common. Ladders exist in games, but I'll be darned if I've run into too many of them in my history. I've run a lot. I mostly run games, and I can't say that I've had a lot of ladders. My players have had to come into contact with. If they're on a ship, there's stairs going up and down. There's rigging, but nobody expects a centaur to get into the rigging. Some dungeons might have ladders up or down. Usually it's stairs or just descending caverns, though. Most dungeons just simply aren't built with ladders. You might have the occasional trap door or secret door that has a ladder, or a tower that uses a ladder. Well, that's fine. The centaur might have to stay back and be the rear guard, but when you're choosing to play that centaur, that is something you're choosing to do. I remember way back in 2nd edition, we had a character who wanted to I had a character or a player who wanted to play a Firbolg, and back then the Firbolg were a giant race, and they could shrink smaller at a certain level. As a player race, they could alter self and change to make themselves human sized. As an monster encounter, they could all do that, but as a player race, the way that they had worked it out in 2nd edition is that I think you had to be like 3rd or 2nd level or something. So this player really wanted to play Firbolg. He'd already been through a couple of characters in that campaign, and he decided he wanted to play this good giant. Who doesn't want to play a good giant? It's a fun concept as a character, but he was only 1st level, so he didn't have the ability to shape change. So there was an adventure where he literally sat there at the mouth of the caves, waiting for everybody to get out. There wasn't a wizard in the party that could shrink him. Nobody had a magic ring that could make him smaller. There was no potion that could do it. He was stuck. So he basically guarded the door to the dungeon while the rest of the party went through it. Wasn't being mean. As a DM, I wasn't trying to be a jerk. That was the dungeon they were going to. And I know there's a lot of philosophy nowadays that says that, hey, you should make sure that everybody in your party can do the thing. That's great. And I can understand where that's a philosophy that might really ring true in something like Adventurers League, which is about coming together to play a game and really kind of a gateway situation for this. But in individual table games, I find that the more that players feel that their characters are truly at risk or truly have to come up with solutions to problems, the more they enjoy the game. And so, I would not want to just suddenly get rid of every ladder because there's a centaur, or make every dungeon 40 feet high so a giant could walk around. Nor am I going to make sure that every adventure takes place in open terrain so the Aarakocra can maximize his flight capabilities. In the end, these characters that have these really odd things about them that other races don't have. Aarakocra and their wings, centaurs and their horse bodies. 3 Kreen. If you were to bring 3 Kreen back into it, they have 4 arms. And in the old days, they got extra attacks, and they could wield 4 weapons at a time, or 1 2-handed weapon and 2 one-handed weapons, or 2 shields and 2 swords. I mean, it was pretty cool. So the thing to remember when you're reading these is, on paper, that may seem, oh my god, he can fly 50 feet. He can only walk 25 feet, and he can't fly while he's wearing any worthwhile armor. So he's a flying pincushion. Falling damage is still falling damage. There's mobility issues. You have to consider that. Also, remember, you're going to have a DM at the table. And that DM is there to keep in mind the nuance of things that may not necessarily be hard print. This is where D&D gets fun. The rules are there to provide the framework. The rest of it's filled in by the players and by the DM. So in the end, these characters really are not they're not game breakers. They just offer a new fun alternative. Yes, you're going to have that Aarakocra that can fly to the top of that rock and get the thing. So that's cool. You still have to get the thing where it's got to go. It was easy getting the thing. Doesn't mean that the guardians that were on that rock aren't still going to come after you. You're just not going to have to necessarily wade up through them. Maybe they're going to come pouring down off that rock. Your DM's going to adapt to this. So hopefully this is maybe softened some opinions. Hopefully, I doubt I'm going to change any hardcore believers' minds. I'm not here to actually make anybody agree with me, but something to consider when you're reading about these races. And I'm sure we're going to see more. They've already covered all the pretty mundane stuff. It's just a matter of coming up with, now that the weirdness is going to come out, especially with the planes opening up. I bet you we're going to start seeing some interesting UA stuff coming up, where we're going to start seeing some really oddball races and stuff, because the planes had a lot of them. So how do you handle your flyers, your quadruped races, your multi-armed races in your games? Have these provided you with problems? Have they turned out to be just paper problems where they really are only an issue on paper? Love to hear how you handled them. Certainly comment below, like, share, and subscribe. And always, it's good to have you here. I appreciate it. And you can email me over at baittheelf@gmail.com. And there's also the Elf Bait Facebook group, and I'm also on Twitter as Elf Bait. So get out and game, everybody. Have a good one.